Economic leadership is what helped bring the Abbott hockey team undone, and undoubtedly the way they manage the economy will also determine the fate of the Malcolm Turnbull-Scott Morrison partnership. One of the nation's finest economic minds belongs to Dr Ken Henry, the former head of the Treasury Department, and he's with me in the studio tonight. Thank you very much for coming in.
It's good to be.
Let's pretend you're back in your old job and Scott Morrison and Malcolm Turnbull walk in and they say, Ken, in a nutshell, tell us what you think our top economic priorities need to be.
Yeah, well, firstly, I'd say it's a good time to be optimistic. It's because that's what's going to be required. The challenges are actually quite immense. Firstly, we've got pretty weak economic growth, and that has implications for living standards. It's undoubtedly the case that living standards are going to grow more slowly in the future than they have at times in the past, and in fact, in the last several years, living standards have not grown much at all for the average Australian. So that's one set of issues. Another is, of course, the fiscal position and the task of fiscal consolidation, which frankly has barely got underway. We're sitting on a budget deficit today of 2.5% of gross domestic product. In round numbers, that's about $40 billion a year. And this is many years after the global financial crisis has passed, and we have, of course, for many years had the tailwinds of strong Asian growth. That's an issue, and we haven't demonstrated capacity to deal with it. Looking a little further ahead to challenges that were identified a long time ago, actually way back in 2002, population ageing. And population ageing has implications for both the trend rate of economic growth, what sort of rates of GDP growth might be feasible, and therefore has implications for living standards. But it also has fiscal implications. It has quite serious implications for the budget position. And way back in 2002, we, on Treasury projections published by Treasurer Costello at the time, we said that without significant changes in government policies, in particular to boost labour productivity and also to boost participation in the workforce, the budget deficit was going to grow. Well, actually at the time it was budget balance. We said a deficit of 5% of gross domestic product is going to emerge over the next 40 decades. Now, in today's terms, 5% of gross domestic product is about $80 billion a year. That's about $70 a week for every man, woman and child in this country. And the reason I put it in those terms is because if we don't do something, we're going to have to raise taxes by that much over the next several decades in order to fund that increase in government spending that is being driven largely by demographics. But there's another demographic challenge that confronts leadership in Australia at the moment, and that is, and there's a lot of opportunity in this as well, but it has to be stated as a challenge. Australia has the fastest rate of population growth in the developed world. The Australian Bureau of Statistics estimates that, or projects rather, that over the next several decades, the next 4 decades, the Australian population will grow by about 4 million people a decade. So for Sydney, that's about 100,000 people a year for the next 40 years. For Melbourne, it's about the same, perhaps even a larger number of people over the next 40 years. And we simply do not have the capability within our policy thinking, policy development apparatus to be able to cope with that sort of population increase.
So much that we could go through,
There's
and
a lot.
You know, we've got limited time, so let me try to just pick up on a few of those things. Fiscal consolidation, you spoke about the deficit. Is the problem in the revenue or too much government spending, or both? Okay,
so in 2002, when the budget was in balance, and I'll start with 2002 because that's when the first intergenerational report was published. In 2002, we had balance, both of them were 25% of gross domestic product. Today, spending is 26% of gross domestic product, and revenue is 23.5% of gross domestic product. So it's a bit more than half of it is explained by a deterioration in revenue performance, by the tax system not delivering in the way that the tax system has delivered in the past.
Would two premiers, the premiers of South Australia and New South Wales, have raised the prospect of lifting the rate of the GST from 10% to 15%. Would that cover that shortfall?
We're going over time. Oh, that shortfall, yes. That shortfall, yes. But then there's the shortfall, the emergent shortfall that I referred to earlier as a consequence of population ageing and so on. which is another 5 percentage points of gross domestic product. It's on top, double what we're presently confronting. And we don't have the tax system to be able to increase revenue by that much. Rather, we have a tax system which apparently is generating a smaller proportion of gross domestic product as government revenue as the years go by. The task of tax reform now is incredibly, incredibly difficult, but also incredibly, incredibly important. The last really big tax reform exercise we had in Australia was, of course, when the GST was introduced, and of course I was involved in that. On that occasion, part of the calculus, and this is political economy stuff, was how much will we have to overcompensate Australian households for in order to have sufficient political support for the introduction of this goods and services tax package. And the estimate was, well, it's just a judgment call, of course, 0.5% of gross domestic product. Now, to put that in today's terms, that's about $8 billion a year, every year, forever. That's in overcompensation, right? So firstly, you need a budget that has the capacity, it's sufficiently in surplus, to deliver that $8 billion a year in overcompensation. The situation we're in now is that we're going to need a much bigger tax reform package than that, and this tax reform package is going to have to be revenue positive, not revenue negative. It's going to have to boost the budget surplus. We've never done this before.
So everything you're saying to me seems big and complicated. It's only a year out until the next election. I mean, what do you tackle first? Where do you start with this? They've got MyEFO coming up. You know, what do they do with MyEFO?
Sure, and there's the federation reform as well. You know, it's for the Prime Minister, obviously, to decide the timing of an election. And the advice that I would give the Prime Minister on this matter would depend very heavily upon the timing of the election in his mind.
What if he
I think there is a case for putting some of these reviews further down the track. Whether the tax reviews should be put further down the track or not is, of course, a matter for judgment. If it were me, I would. I think that the present circumstances make it too difficult to develop a sufficient tax reform package. The time is not there, but it's not just a matter of time. As the Howard and Costello government demonstrated with the GST, there needs to be 12 to 18 months spent in preparing the ground for the tax reform package, in genuine education of, or at least consultation with the Australian community and all sectors of the Australian community. That hasn't happened. And we're going to need at least that for this tax reform package.
I need you to stay here for an hour, but the show's going to be over in 5 minutes, so unfortunately we're going to have to leave it there, but I hope you can come back on another occasion and keep talking through some of these issues with us.
It would be a pleasure.
Thank you.